on climate change adaptation. And I'm the assistant principal for King's Climate and Sustainability, which is a college-wide initiative seeking to embed climate and sustainability into everything we do. The topic of our debate this afternoon is whether offsetting should have a role in higher education. This is in the context of a working group that was created earlier this year to develop a new policy and position for King's College on offsetting, whether we should or shouldn't, and if we do, how. And we felt it was very important as part of the work to engage with our academic and student community. And this is the second debate that we're holding. The first debate was seeking to understand some of the ethical and practical questions associated with offsetting. And this one is really looking at the experience of particularly other institutions. We've got speakers from the University of Oxford and Cambridge University, as well as the EAUC, an acronym which I always forget exactly what it is. Fiona, you'll remind us what the EAUC stands for.
Yes, it's the Environmental Association for Universities and Colleges.
There you go. Thank you very much. So we've got some really exceptional experts, and we will get them to introduce themselves when we get into the debate format. Just to set the terms, because climate change and carbon offsetting are pretty technical issues, and I thought I would just start by setting out some of the basic technical terms of the debate. Yona, I wonder whether you could just advance to the next slide. Right, so I think if you just bring these up. One thing I think everyone does know about carbon offsets is that they're very controversial. They developed as part, actually, quite a long time ago, of a set of market-based instruments which emerged following the Kyoto Agreement in 1997, but became established very much as a sort of a market activity, quite a valuable market activity over the last decade or so. And certainly there's been a bit of a crunch in the last few years as the market has grown, and there have been real questions about the authenticity of many of these credits, issues to do with transparency, additionality, and so on, which we'll get onto. So we know it's controversial, even though many organizations, including universities, are doing it. Next slide, please. So the status broadly in the higher education sector, and this is internationally, we had, for instance, a very interesting discussion with Duke University, a big US university, which decided more than 10 years ago that it was going to become carbon neutral. And the way it was going to do that was by getting involved in pretty high level purchases of carbon offsets. And in fact, this year they will achieve carbon neutrality through that. The University of California did rather similar things, but has now moved away from that, and so on. So there's been really active engagement actually in other parts of the world, particularly North America and Australia, as you can see, in carbon offsetting, although I think it's true to say that in many places people are now having a bit of a review about the exact position, and it's very useful that we've got two big UK institutions here to describe what they are doing. Next slide, please. So some of the key terms, and I won't belabor these, but and I hope some of you, if you were at the earlier debate, will have come across some of these ideas before. Just flash them up. You don't need to be an expert in any of them, but there is quite a lot of jargon in this area. I mean, broadly, what you're doing with with carbon offsetting is you're investing in environmental projects to balance out carbon emissions that you yourself are responsible for, either through your direct activities or through activities in your supply chain or things that you're not directly managing. And that could be through, ideally, through the disposal of carbon, for instance, in carbon sequestration projects, or through investing in energy efficiency or other projects which reduce emissions in certain industrial activities, for instance. The carbon insetting is a concept that's emerged more recently, where an organization seeks within its own boundaries to reduce carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. Typically within an offsetting policy, there is then also actually the establishment of an internal carbon pricing mechanism, a way of imputing an economic or financial value to investing in carbon emissions reductions internally, which then indicates the price one would be willing to pay for a carbon offset externally.
And artificial intelligence helps you and your collaborators.
I don't know what's happening there, but if you could mute, that would be great. Net zero, well, net zero is obviously the idea that you achieve, you go to zero emissions. There are some irreducible emissions which have to be residual irreducible emissions which have to be dealt with through additional measures like disposal elsewhere. The idea of carbon neutrality is that you achieve what Duke have done by continuing to emit, but finding ways of reducing, compensating for those emissions elsewhere. And residual emissions are those things which remain at the end, even though you've done everything you can to reduce your own emissions. So look, some of these terms are out there, they will crop up. There'll be other terms like additionality and transparency, which I mentioned earlier, which I hope that the speakers will explain. Okay, let's move on to the debate quickly. Yona, I think we can probably. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to invite each of the speakers, and I think there's an order. We're going to start with Stephen to just briefly explain, what they do in their organization, and then highlight one of the issues that we have asked them to talk about. So I'm going to hand over to Stephen now.
Thank you very much, Franz. It's lovely to join you all. Hello, everybody. My name is Stephen Thompson. I work for an organisation called Arup, which is a global sustainable consultancy, and I lead Arup's carbon offsetting and pricing team. I have the great pleasure of working with organisations who are looking to purchase carbon credits from the voluntary carbon market, but also working with projects who are looking to create carbon credits and sell those on the voluntary carbon market. I have a number of hats, but one of those hats as well is that I'm responsible for the purchase and retirement of credits associated with Arup's own residual emissions. So as a global organisation, we unfortunately do have residual emissions associated with our aviation business travel, and I am responsible for purchasing carbon credits from the voluntary carbon market to offset those residual emissions. And last year was around 15,000 tonnes that we purchased from the voluntary carbon market, all with 100% greenhouse gas removals. It won't surprise you that I am an advocate for carbon offsetting. I feel very passionately about greenhouse gas removals and trying to find and establish a pathway so that we can address our residual emissions and not waiting for some mythical year in the future to be able to address something, to get started now. Franz, does that do for an intro? Oh, sorry, Franz, I think you're on mute.
Stephen, just add, so we're talking here about higher education. Do you think there's a distinction between a commercial enterprise like Arup and what you're doing on offsetting and a charity, educational, institution, research institution like a university or not?
I think we all have a responsibility for our residual emissions, and therefore I think we all do good things in our own business and our own research worlds, and therefore I think that we all have a responsibility to be taking action. So I think it's both a public, private, charitable and everyone sectors to be able to challenge this topic. So in answer to your question, Franz, I think yes, education should be doing something around carbon offsetting.
Fantastic, very clear, very good. Inji, could I invite you quickly to introduce yourself and quickly to say where you stand on this debate?
Absolutely. Thank you, Franz, and thank you for the invitation today. So my name is Inji Johnston. I'm a research associate in net zero aligned offsetting at the University of Oxford. So my research works to develop the Oxford offsetting principles and then operationalize them out in the real world. And so what's quite interesting in the process of even developing the offsetting principles and in particular their revision, the question comes up, do we support offsetting? And what's really important to acknowledge is that rather than kind of picking it for or against offsetting, I think it completely depends on the conditions in which it happens. And right now, the status quo of offsetting is broken, and we acknowledge that in the revised principles. And it comes back to this very natural issue that if you talk to the person on the street about what they think carbon credit represents or offsetting represents, they say it's someone planting a tree, for to offset by emissions if I go on a flight. And so they'd be very surprised to kind of find out that that's less than 10% of the current market, and also that there can be vintages for projects whose emissions impact occurred as far back as 2006 or beyond. And so I think, rather than kind of being for or against offsetting, we work to strengthen and show how net zero alignment is possible. And so we release these revised principles, which are 4 key principles, which we can go into later. But I believe that universities have a really key role to play in kind of showcasing what net zero aligned offsetting could look like. In particular, the principle 4, which is innovative and integrated approaches. And here, really leveraging all levers and arms of a university, from its research and teaching through to its endowment and financial assets, right through, of course, to its external engagements, including like this. So I'm very glad to be here and continue this discussion.
Really interesting and a fantastically nuanced view. And if you haven't yet read the revised Oxford principles, they are actually guiding, I think, probably now really globally the debate about how we should approach offsetting, and they've certainly informed our thinking a lot. If I can then introduce Fiona Goodwin. Fiona.
Thanks, Franz. Hi, everybody. I'm Fiona Goodwin. I'm the Deputy CEO of the EAUC, and we developed the Carbon Coalition, which is an offsetting initiative for the education sector. That came from a recommendation through guidance developed by what was called then the COP26 Universities Network, which is now called the UK University Climate Network. I think I got that acronym right. And that was a recommendation that we can try and galvanise the expertise that we have in the sector through our experts on offsetting and academics and researchers to really help develop good quality offsetting options for the education sector. So this is a very, as I think everyone on the call will agree, a very complex area, and not everybody has the expertise on hand within their institutions to navigate this complex area. So the Carbon Coalition was very much set up in order to help universities and colleges to navigate that complex area and to give them confidence in that. So we have an advisory board that underpins the Carbon Coalition, and they set scoring criteria for offsetting projects to meet, which go beyond the accreditation standards, such as gold standard, for example, and that also really picks out particular areas such as additionality, and also, and I think this is a really crucial part for education, is the research opportunities that come from many offsetting projects.
Yeah, and if I could just ask you, in your experience working through the Carbon Coalition, how many would you say, how many universities in the UK are currently sort of actively involved with either doing or thinking about offsetting?
I think there's between 30 and 50 at the moment.
Right.
A lot of that is coming from the requirement from the Wellcome Trust.
Yeah.
So if any institution receives funding from the Wellcome Trust, regardless of what that funding is for, there is a requirement to offset any travel that's related to that funded project.
Yeah.
And that is sort of one of the sort of main areas that universities are approaching offsetting with. But also increasingly for other things, such as if they hold events, in-person events, for example, or particular departments that want to offset for their own purposes.
Yeah.
So it's a mixture.
So it is what you're saying. It's actually quite a common practice right now for certain, particularly aviation related, and now increasingly event related emissions. Yeah, very, very helpful. Good. Okay. So then I would like to turn to Eleanor Tover Scott. Eleanor.
It's Eleanor Toy Scott. Sorry,
Toy
Franz.
Scott. Sorry.
Thank you.
Can't read. Yeah.
That's okay. Hi, I'm Eleanor Toy Scott. I work for the Cambridge Centre for Carbon Credits, and my role there is really to help to operationalise that research group's scientific research, which is all aimed at supporting trustworthy carbon and biodiversity initiatives quite broadly, but particularly carbon credits has been at the core of what that group is doing. And the group emerged from Cambridge's Carbon Offsetting Working Group, which was set up by the university's Environmental Sustainability Strategy Committee back in 2019, I think, to really explore what the options might be for the university around offsetting. I think there was quite a lot of excitement about this possibility at the time, but also a lot of caution and concern about the quality of many of the credits that were out there, whether they were something that we could, as a university, invest in or not. And so that group produced a report, and then that led on to the creation of the Cambridge Centre for Carbon Credits, 4C, which is a collaboration across computer science, which is where I'm based, and zoology and plant sciences. So it's very unusual in, bringing together academics across those different disciplines. And we also, of course, consult with and bring in expertise from people in the social sciences and all sorts of other interdisciplinary areas as well. So, yeah, it's quite an unusual group. And part of the point of it has all along been to enable Cambridge University to invest confidently in some carbon credits. And so a lot of what I've been doing over the past year or so has been actually trying to make that happen, enabling the university to buy some credits which have been assessed by 4C using their own evaluation criteria as being good, and which the university can therefore rely on and say they're happy to invest in. And that's happened in the context of the university's environmental strategy. Maybe I should say more about that later, because we're going to get into the specifics of the what your organisation is doing later on. But in terms of my general views on offsetting, I'll try and say that very, very quickly. I think, we all know that we've got these twin crises of carbon, the twin crises of global warming and biodiversity collapse. And those can be tackled in various ways. Obviously, there's government action, which can include regulation. It can include putting money into various things. And then there's philanthropy. And we know that those activities are not going to be enough to fill the gap, to enable us to reduce our emissions enough. So I feel like offsetting is required to try to fill that gap. But it has to be done properly. As Inji was saying, you know, you can't just say, oh, well, I bought a carbon credit, that's fine, now I can do whatever I like. And that's the danger, that, you know, that it kind of licenses people to continue to emit. And that certainly does happen. I mean, there's some research that I've heard about recently showing that companies that claim net zero, you know, many of them are actually emitting more because they're buying a lot of carbon credits, so they feel fine about it. And obviously that's counterproductive and not okay. So you need to have a strategy that prevents that. And you also need appropriate evidence that the carbon credits that you're buying actually are storing the carbon that they say that they're storing. And that's a lot of what 4C's work has been all about.
Yeah, good. Okay, so it sounds as though Cambridge is beginning to buy offsets and buy carbon credits, and as a way of, are there specific emissions that you're offsetting, or is it sort of in general, you know, just a way of?
Yes, it's very specific. I got chapter and verse on this from my colleague in the environmental sustainability team before coming on this panel. So it's specifically to allow staff members to offset their essential business flights.
Yes.
And that is on the understanding that they're following the sustainable travel guidelines, which say they shouldn't be flying at all unless they absolutely have to.
Yes.
And it's not contributing towards any of the university's targets at all. It's additional to any targets that we're trying to meet. So it's partly because we don't have a net zero target. We have absolute targets for scope 1 and scope 2, but we don't have any targets yet for scope 3, I don't think.
Yes.
So yeah, it's a kind of an additional activity. Very
useful. Thank you. Very, very clear. Excellent. Now I'm going to turn to Malcolm. Malcolm.
Thanks, Franz, and I'm delighted to be speaking after Inji and Eleanor in particular, because an awful lot of my points are very similar to theirs. First of all, Franz, to respond to your question to Stephen, universities are definitely in here. The fact that we're a charity, the fact that we believe that we're doing good, you know, doesn't absolve us from this. And, you know, we are big economic entities. King's, the estimation from you and your team, Franz, is that we have 25,000 tonnes of scope 1 and scope 2 emissions every year, 175,000 scope 3 tonnes of scope 3 emissions. So we're a big economic entity, and we can't be out of this. For me, my role will be balancing our investment needs for our academic and student improvements against decarbonisation, net zero investments. They will obviously be in contention with each other, and so I want the most efficient way in which we can make these investments. And obviously there are significant payback opportunities here. 20 years ago, the energy market flipped so that you can make genuine investment cases around this. And that's really colouring my view on offsetting at the moment. Three points to make, really. First of all, there is so much that we can do about our scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, and that is where I would want us to prioritise spending. Space optimisation, energy efficiency, decarbonising our energy use, and those necessary behaviour changes without compromising some of our excellent research, which is quite energy intensive. The second point really is that at the moment, and your headlines sort of were the snapshots of this, you know, what is the efficacy of offsetting plans? You know, when we look at, you know, we need science and evidence-based plans, not wish-based plans. And the third one is that inevitably, you know, the transition to a green environment, a significantly less carbon emitting environment, will probably be the biggest challenge in the next 20 years for all of us involved in leadership or management of organisations. I know that King's will jump instinctively to a just transition to a new world, and just selling our carbon and allowing us to go ahead in the same old ways, it feels to me very colonial and very much like buying indulgences for sins in the Middle Ages here. Yeah, a just transition is not just shifting, is not just paying for carbon credits and then carrying on exactly as we are. So that's where I am.
Very clear again, and we're getting a range of opinions here, really good. And then finally, Gulcin, just a sort of introductory comment from you, Gulcin.
Hi, everyone. Again, I'm really happy to be here, like the other participants. I'm Gulcin Özkan. I'm Professor of Finance in the Business School at King's. My involvement with the issues we have talked about so far, obviously very direct involvement is through my participation in the carbon offset working group, which has been relatively recent. But I have also been involved in dealing with climate change issues. First of all, in my teaching, I teach a graduate module in emerging markets finance. So in this module, I show data to my students that emerging markets are particularly at the mercy of climate change. Therefore, we need proactive action. But I'm also involved in it through my research. I'm a macroeconomist by training, and whether policy should respond to climate change is a big issue. For example, whether central banks in setting monetary policy decisions, specifically interest rates, should care about climate risk, whether banks, when they are lending to companies with green investment, whether they should provide better lending conditions, or regulatory authorities should incentivize banks to do that. So there are lots of really interesting questions. I don't want to extend this bit. I just want to say one sentence and then stop. My view is we should go for carbon offsets, but I will be able to explain why. On balance, I know it's a very controversial issue. On balance, I feel we should, rather than do something else.
Okay, excellent.
Thank you.
Good. Okay, so now we are just going to carry on with a few, more detailed statements, I think, from the panel. And I suppose the first question, I mean, elaborating a bit on what you already said, is directed at Eleanor, Inge, and Fiona. Which is really to do with what your organizations are currently doing about offsetting and how you got to that position. So, and I suppose this is trying to inform also what we at King's ought to be doing, learning from your previous experience, how you came to the position you got to, so that we can really learn. So, Inge, I wonder whether you could, Eleanor, sorry, I wonder whether you could start with the work of the offsetting working group at Cambridge University and how you ended up with your very interesting position, which is that you created a sort of research arm to enable the organization to do all of this.
Yes, I mean, I think that happened rather organically rather than as being a kind of a pre-planned thing. So Professor Andrew Bamford was a key person in launching the offsetting working group, because he's a conservationist who's been interested in carbon finance and whether that could be used to pay for forest conservation, and if so, through what mechanisms, for quite a long time, I think going back probably as far as 2010. And another important person in this story is Professor Ian Leslie, who's a former head of department at the Computer Science Department in Cambridge, but he's currently director of the IT function within the University Administration, and he's also a senior advisor to the Vice Chancellor on information system strategy and environmental sustainability. So I think those two senior key people, one in the administration and somebody else in academia, or sort of, within the department, they were both important people at the beginning of all of this, talking about what the university could possibly do. And I think in 2019, there was quite a lot of positivity about the voluntary carbon market, as well as these various concerns. And Andrew recruited a chap called Tom Swinfield, who's really the head of science now. He's a senior postdoctoral researcher in 4C, and he sort of leads all the different research efforts that are going on within 4C. But Tom and Andrew together were really the people who spearheaded the report of the carbon offsetting working group.
Right.
And one of the things that Tom did in a lot of detail was gathering requirements from the people on the Environmental Sustainability Strategy Committee. He went and interviewed each person on that committee for an hour to an hour and a half, really to understand what their thoughts were about offsetting, what their priorities were and concerns, just to sort of try to understand what the university might want or need from carbon offsets, and what also what might sort of stop them from going down that route. So he did quite a lot of work in that area, and then investigated lots of different types of carbon credits, including the removals type of carbon credits,
Right.
and compared them on lots of different parameters. And based on that, kind of both extracted what he thought were the key metrics. So these were additionality, you know, how much carbon does it save in addition to what would have happened under a business as usual kind of scenario.
Yeah.
Leakage, in other words, how much of this is displaced if you stop this activity happening in one place. You know, if you save this bit of forest, is the agriculture all just going to move down the road or possibly to the other side of the world? And how can you tell? And then the other issue is permanence, because of course the removals kinds of carbon credits have the advantage of, you know, at least potentially storing the carbon forever, whereas it's more complicated when it comes to forests. I mean, obviously you hope that if you can create a sustainable project such that you've halted deforestation, then effectively the forest does store the carbon forever, even though individual trees will cycle round. But in a less than ideal world, you know that at the end of a particular project, it may be that, you know, logging or clearance for agriculture is going to resume at the end of the project. And how do you account for that within your model?
Or
so we looked at all those different things. Yeah, indeed, lots of different things can happen. And he said that all the different credits that they looked at have problems of some kind or another. Some are very expensive, some are very, very cheap. It's a bit unclear what the right price for carbon should be, and there are lots of different factors influencing that, which aren't necessarily to do with the quality of the credits, including confidence in the market. He made a big table in the report of all the different kinds of credits and their quantified climate benefits, which he adjusted for non-additionality, for leakage and impermanence, and for how transparent they were about the risks involved, and also thought about some of the human benefits of some of the nature-based credits and biodiversity benefits, and came to the conclusion that forest conservation came out looking pretty good value overall. Those are not necessarily the only good value credits, but they're relatively easy to quantify because you can quantify the above ground biomass from remote sensing data a bit more easily than you can with some of the others. And so and they also of course have the biodiversity and community benefits if they're good projects. So that was the route that he and Andrew in their report recommended that we should go down, and that's the area that that 4C has primarily focused on, is the RED plus type of projects. But we're also starting to look at reforestation and, you know, other mangrove, other types of projects as well.
Okay, that's really interesting and rich historical context, which is important. Inji, I wonder whether you could just quickly talk about the Oxford approach, which is again very different, but kind of research informed in its own way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, it's fantastic to lead on from Eleanor, because, I think the two universities are focusing on very different ends of the spectrum, both very essential, but it's great to be able to bring them together end to end. I think I'll just preface my comments with that I'm on the very research side of the university with knowledge of the operational side. So while some aspects are obviously inherent in our tangible offsetting scheme, I'll be talking much more about our kind of broader work on offsetting and how that contributes, particularly to that principle for, like I said, that innovative and integrated approaches to net zero aligned offsetting. But one thing I guess to start with, so any kind of offsetting strategy as we've already heard, has to start with these emissions reductions. And that's why before even talk of carbon credits, it's really important that organisations, universities and otherwise really do look at their internal emissions and the levers that they have to decarbonise and prioritise spending in those areas first. But then beyond that, I think there's two key aspects to a good offsetting strategy. So you both have the compensation element, which is where you are addressing your residual tonnes using carbon credits once you've already done that work to decarbonise. But then there's also this contribution element, and in the revised principles we kind of see that the compensation element is up to 100% of your residual tonnes, and then you can move into the contribution paradigm as well. So on the compensation front, similar to as Eleanor and others have said, we also focus on our flight emissions, so applying a internal levy to based on the length of the flight and kind of calculations that's inbuilt into the software that you use when you're booking your travel. And through that, it helps provide that signal before someone's choosing to get the flight, so they can actually physically see the carbon impact of that, and hopefully reassess and take a train or take alternatives, including video conferencing where possible. And then we also have a number of different departments of colleges that are taking their own approaches and really kind of looking in-house at their both decarbonisation options and then also their kind of specific expertise in developing their own in-setting projects, or also voyaging into that world of offsetting. So that's kind of on the compensation element. So that's looking very much at the university operations. But then from a research perspective, we also have a very big contribution that we can make as tertiary institutions. For example, in terms of our research, we can engage right across from the theory of carbon markets right through to the very practice-oriented, project-based assessments on the ground. As I said, that we take, we're focusing on a different kind of aspect of the voluntary carbon market in terms of looking specifically often at removals and kind of trying to bridge that gap, because we have less than 10% of removals kind of on the voluntary carbon market today, and we not only need to elevate that or grow that number in terms of volume, but we also need to shift it to more durable forms of removal and really get into the weeds of addressing those issues of reversals. But also more broadly, I think us as universities have the opportunity to take a bit more of a systems view. And so that also means engaging in a wide range of consultations. For instance, here in the UK, consultations about what integrating carbon credits or removal units into the UK's ETS, what that looks like. Also means engaging in the climate negotiations, for instance, Article 6, and the implications that that will have for how countries will meet their targets, and as well as how corporates, and including universities and institutions, can play a role in that. And then also, as part of our research, we also have to consider who's funding it, who are we partnering with that. And so it's also important to kind of have some policies and procedures around that. And again, I would caution, just like with offsetting, that we shouldn't adopt this black and white approach, but rather really get into the weeds of the details of, in terms of assessing partnerships, and particularly partnerships that do have that potential catalytic impact of reducing emissions or building better offsetting alternatives, is to look at transition plans and other aspects of engaging with these funders to really assess that whether that's a good fit, and in doing so transparently. So I think we have a vast array of levers, both to address our compensation, but make this contribution. Okay, thank you.
Really, really helpful. And I think what you've explained to us is that offsetting is one of the levers that organizations should be pulling, and the way in which you operate them should be in a sort of holistic way. And different organizations may choose to operate those levers in slightly different ways. Really helpful. And then finally, I wanted to just invite Fiona to say a little bit more about, I suppose, the Carbon Coalition and how that operates, and I suppose what effect that has had on the way institutions might be addressing this issue of offsetting.
Yeah, thanks, Fran. And just sort of taking on Inji's point there in terms of the system change of how, by coming together through the Carbon Coalition, we hope that the sector can really drive the change that's needed within the offsetting sector. And particularly sort of, again, what's already been said about sort of removal versus reduction projects, and obviously carbon capture and storage is the ideal sort of aim. However, demand far outstrips supply, and this is where there's a lag in the research elements of that. And so if we can try and get more universities to do research into carbon capture and storage, then that helps bring the sector along, but also if the education sector are then purchasing those carbon credits, then there's a real sort of the supply there as well. So it's all about supply and demand. But I think also, again, taking Malcolm's point in terms of sort of the colonial and just transition approach, and we have had at the advisory group some speakers from a new scheme from Red Plus on sovereign carbon credits, which is particularly countries taking control of the rainforests they have and not allowing external third-party companies coming in and setting up offsetting projects. So Papua New Guinea is sort of the spearhead for this, in terms of they don't allow any other organisation apart from the government to do offsetting projects on their own rainforests. And I think that's a really interesting approach to take that. There's huge governance issues and they're very stringent upon that. So this may change over time due to change of leadership. But for example, Brazil was not allowed to be part of that because they didn't have governance, the very clear, transparent governance structures in place. And I just wanted to talk about a little bit about in terms of the transparency that what universities do. And I think that's a really important aspect that needs communicating both to staff and students and the wider public in what is it that you're actually doing and what are the projects that you're offsetting in. And I think there can be a lot of calls of greenwashing, and I think having that transparency and trying to really educate people about what projects you're investing in and why, in terms of what approaches are you taking, what different things have you considered into working with that project. And again, with the Carbon Coalition, we have a scoring criteria which is all publicly available. We publicly score the projects, and they particularly can address certain SDGs. If, for example, if particular universities want to focus on a particular SDG or a particular item. And also we have conditions of entry of the Carbon Coalition, so you have to have a carbon reduction plan, you have to have a net zero target, and you have to publicly report against that, progress against that. And I think also, and this will be coming into our new portfolio, which is coming out next month, but I think it's really also important that a really brilliant example is the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine have developed their own offsetting project. And this is really fascinating because they're using the research centres that they have. They're particularly focused on Uganda initially, but their plans to make that more sort of global. So really utilising the research that they do and developing carbon offsetting projects at those, so they can really see the impact that they're making, but also have the governance and the control around that as well. So it's an amazing example of how universities can actually use the research and the expertise they have. It's no small undertaking, by the way. It's hugely complex. But again, we're delighted to have London Hygiene School Tropical Medicine as part of the portfolio. And again, that's another role that the Carbon Coalition is supporting the education sector by using the education sector and the expertise that we have.
Great, thank you very much. And of course, the Wellcome Trust, which you mentioned earlier, I think specifies that universities, when they have a Wellcome Trust grant and there's business aviation associated with it, has to be offsetting using your scheme, using the EAUC scheme. So you've become a sort of standard, I think, at least for that funder. Right, that is a very interesting set of interventions and demonstrates the variety of approaches. The last one the London School example you give, which is an institution itself developing, as it were, an offsetting scheme powered by its own research. So all sorts of different ways of getting into this. Then quickly, let us move to the third question, which we had sort of thought of as, how should universities strike the balance between offsetting and not offsetting? And I wondered why don't we start with Stephen, and then we'll follow up with Gulcin and Malcolm on that. So just striking the balance, perhaps, Stephen, you could give us a few thoughts about how we ought to be thinking about that.
Thank you, Franz. I think I probably have this conversation twice a week with different clients. I think it is the topic of the moment. What should I be doing? I think everyone is strapped for cash in terms of what should they be investing their funds in to be able to do. And I think it's an important question to kind of address and explore. I should say, decarbonize, decarbonize, decarbonize. We need to close the carbon gap. As a structural engineer, working 10 years in the built environment, I understand fully the built environment, for example, your own universities, about the amount of emissions associated with the upkeep and the running of those of your institution. And so therefore, there's an important balance to be striking between reducing your own emissions and then thinking about how you're stimulating the market to remove greenhouse gas emissions more globally. I think it's a very difficult challenge, and there's a couple of things that you have at your disposal to kind of play around with to explore this a little bit further. I would always recommend and start off with thinking about your own decarbonisation pathway, and as a result, thinking about what is a sensible internal carbon price. From the work that we've done when we've worked with other organisations, is that as soon as you set a price, or essentially a financial implication of a residual emission, of an emission, it changes behaviour, and that is what this task is all about. So if someone suddenly understands that, hang on a minute, it's going to cost me to do something a little bit more than what I used to do, it starts to again influence that behaviour. And if you set that price correctly, your internal carbon price will accelerate decarbonisation, but at the same time, will also give you sufficient funds to be able to then purchase something meaningful within the voluntary carbon market. And I think what lots of the other panelists have described today in terms of the types of projects that are available on the voluntary carbon market is that we're wanting to make sure that when you do buy something, that it has genuine good. So making sure that it has a climate story to it, but then also looking about wider co-benefits. So talk about social value, biodiversity. So that's kind of my challenge to yourselves, and when you're thinking about how you're setting your own net zero strategy, is to think about how you are going to actually incentivize that behavioral change. And one of the best ways to try to tackle that is with people's purses.
Very clear. Quickly on establishing carbon prices, internal carbon prices, there's huge variation, of course, in the level that different organizations have chosen. You gave the example, I think, in one of our meetings, Stephen, and correct me if I'm wrong, that Westminster City Council, so one of our local borough councils here, set an internal carbon price above 600 pounds per tonne. I think that's right, which is, an extraordinary number, but that's where they ended up. But there are organisations which might be using a carbon price which is well below that. So how, if we were going to have an internal carbon price, and I take your argument for one, how would we go about trying to set the right level?
So I always start with first of all, Franz, the Westminster City Council have two prices. £880 is their top number, so even more than your 600. And they also have 330 if the building is associated with purely electricity. But anyway, 880, big numbers, right? And that number 880 has been set on the cost to essentially install a solar panel power PV panel on top of one of their buildings, to be able to reduce their emissions by 1 tonne. So that's a pure abatement. So that's how much it costs to abate 1 tonne of emission within their portfolio
themselves.
So when we're talking about the hard to abate sectors like the built environment, that's the numbers that we're looking at to actually reduce those emissions or eliminate those emissions potentially completely.
Okay.
So when I talk about, there are the benchmarks that you can kind of sit on, but one of them is the UK government have a policy appraisal for measuring that abatement cost, and they've got 3 curves, a low, a central and a high series. The central series at the moment is around £310 per tonne to abate 1 tonne of emission. Now, there's plenty of experts on this call here, but if I said that if you were to go into the voluntary carbon market and purchase a credit for £310, you're going to get something pretty meaningful. And so I always start from the position that you need to think about what that cost is to abate, and then making sure that that price aligns with your ambitions. So if you want to follow Inji's great guidance when it comes to durable greenhouse gas removals, then you're going to be looking at that price point. So it's a balancing act between making sure that you are doing something good with your purchasing power, but again, always incentivizing decarbonisation.
Very good, very clear. Good. Then on to Gulcin quickly about how we make the balance, how we strike the balance. What are the principles we might have to use here? Any insights?
Thank you, Franz. So Stephen has given really good examples, specific examples, and I would like to take a step backwards and look at it from a principles point of view. So at the end of the day, if we are thinking of trade-offs, there's a balance, there's no clear answer. There has to be that there are pros and cons in doing that. So pros and cons of carbon offset are the reason, the existence of both is the reason why it's such a controversial issue, right? So clearly, those very strong proponents of it argue that climate challenge is such a big challenge that no firm, sector or country can deal with it on its own. So we need every tool in the book that we can use, and we can therefore use offsetting in addition to everything else that you can use. So in that sense, I think that's a very kind of robust starting point. You can also make the argument that it can lead to faster decarbonization if used properly, in the sense that, for example, if a big polluter used aggressive form or aggressively offsetting, they may be able to offset or more than what they are emitting, or at least maybe they have emitted more in the past, so they can overcompensate, which has to be good. It could also have other benefits, such as improved biodiversity or financial help to developing countries in their transition. But clearly, it could also be very ineffective, as the first slide you showed, 90% of the schemes that have been around, even those that have been certified, have turned out to be really, really ineffective. So if they are ineffective, would we be better off investing it somewhere else, investing it in greening technologies? I think the key for this particular criticism derives from the fact that the quality varies hugely. So you might find very effective forms of offsetting, but there are others where really you are much better off investing it elsewhere. So this, I think, if we summarize, the main downside is, for net zero, we need a huge societal shift in behavior, and carbon offsets might mislead people thinking it's possible without making that shift. So it's only good if it comes as a addition or supplement or complement to everything else that we need to be doing. So it needs to be chosen extremely carefully. So that brings me to the specific question that you pose about higher education institutions. So what's special or specific about universities? Do we need to think differently about carbon offsetting? And my starting point, as a point I made during our previous committee meetings, is that as a higher education institution, our primary focus is on the well-being of future generations. And what's more relevant than climate change to the well-being of future generations? So in that sense, we have an absolute responsibility to incorporate as much of it as possible in our education, in our research, in our investment. So it's absolutely key that we take this very, very seriously. In addition, I think Malcolm has already, and Stephen mentioned, we are big polluters, obviously not as big as some big polluters, but we are big polluters. Given the current technology, our research, intensive nature and the internationalization, particularly of relevance to UK universities, we will always emit, given the current technology, and therefore we also have responsibility to clean up, to be proactive in cleanup activities. Finally, I think this is kind of on a positive note, given our pioneering role in climate research, we are, I think, personally, I believe, in a good position to make that choice properly, in the sense that when we said pros versus cons, and we said that you need to choose this extremely carefully in terms of what you offset and how you offset. So this kind of pioneering role in research should allow us to do that properly. And as an economist, I would like to believe that we will have enough sufficient mechanisms and modelings to allow us to answer that question, what would be the most efficient way of investing? But, I would want to finish by saying it absolutely has to be complementary rather than replacing the genuine efforts in emission reductions.
Yeah, excellent. Very interesting indeed. And some common themes here about complementarity coming through, of course, in the, Malcolm, finally, and before we open this out to the audience for their comments, just on how you think, and you've begun to open this up a bit, how you think we should strike the balance here.
Okay, thanks. And I really endorse Gulson's points about that, and I really like Fiona's point about honesty and transparency here, not greenwashing. This is not a public relations exercise. This is a little bit more important than being able to put a tick in the box to whichever person asks us about this. I think I want to bring it into the short term and then go into the long term here. The structure of our university, and we are a big economic entity, as I've said. The nature of our academic research is not quite as energy intensive as some organisations. We're not big engineering yet, but we have ambitions to grow in there. But obviously, high performance computing, use of clean rooms in health sciences, imaging sciences. These are all very energy intensive. We do not want to compromise superb research, which is doing fantastic, giving fantastic benefit to the world. Equally, structurally, UK universities at the moment are pretty much dependent upon international students. We have 14,000 students, international students. Most of those will come to the UK and return to their home countries by air. The research professor going off to a conference in California, we can try to stop that, but actually, we're complicit in lots more international travel, and that is the economic structure of UK universities at the moment. So I think it's a really interesting aspect about carbon pricing, and I really valued Stephen's points there. I don't think, however, I would endorse that, hey, do some internal carbon pricing and that allows you to buy some offsets. I would want to do some internal carbon pricing in order to generate the funds to be able to improve our scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, because there is a big open goal for us there. Gulson's point about behaviour change, I absolutely endorse that. So I think it's something really clever that we could do here. And Franz, you and I have talked about this, but it's been sort of slightly consenting adults behind closed doors when we talk about structural changes around our resource allocation model. But I think there's something there that we could really look at, and that could then be the investment fund for scope 1 and scope 2 changes. I think that then the role of offsetting in the longer term is the residual aspect, because I see it very, very difficult for us to get to net zero in terms of our economy without some offsetting. But I want to be really strong on we reduce that residual amount to the lowest possible point, because I think that's consistent with our responsibilities to the planet. That would be very, very consistent with King's ethos as a moral institution.
Excellent. Really wonderful and interesting. So now it's the turn of the many people who are online. So I hope that's given you lots of food for thought. I'm sure it has. We've all been very informed, I think, by what we've heard today. And I suppose it would be just good to have responses from anyone who's listening, or questions that you have to the experts we have. Don't be shy. I mean, these are valuable minutes. We've got another 27 minutes or so where we can ask questions, challenge people. Does anyone want to start by asking a question, or shall I? Okay. Anyone want to get going with this? Okay, let me ask a question.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Can I ask a question?
Why don't you ask a question, Malcolm?
Yeah. I think it was Inju who said this earlier about teaching, research, and our investment policies. But I'd be really interested to hear, where we think that could go, not just in offsetting terms, but also, in the general benefit terms, and to learn what others are doing.
Yeah, absolutely. I can kick us off there. And so actually that aspect is something I dived into a bit more in my broader kind of net zero research. And I wrote a chapter, and it's still forthcoming, but on universities as net zero norm entrepreneurs. And it looked at that in the 3 key lenses: the research, third sector engagement, and then also as financial institutions. And the financial institutions element actually came out of a lot of the, or first emerged on the scene really as part of the broader student protests and others about divestment, the big endowments like Harvard and others who, were put under pressure from students and staff members to kind of really assess what their money was going to in terms of their investments. And I think it stimulated a really good discussion. And also back to, even today's discussion, we've heard a lot about Scope 1 and Scope 2, but one of the categories of Scope 3 is financed emissions. And so there is that direct connection in terms of universities as a form of financial institution to assess the lending and kind of where that's going to. So I think it's a direct and important causal link, but then just as I said, we're looking at where our money is being spent, but also who we're receiving it from, and so also having policies on that end. And I think that's helps to create that end-to-end policy. And I'd love to hear from others how they find that.
Does that answer your question, Malcolm? I think
it's really helpful.
Yeah. Okay, good. It is the question about transparency, I suppose, in the end, and our ability to track not only our Scope 1, Scope 2, our Scope 3 emissions, actually establish what they are. There's still huge uncertainties, I think, about that, even though we have a number, whether we trust it or not. And then how we, in this case, make sense of the imputed emissions associated with investments that we might have in endowments, but also, in other parts of our operations. Yeah. Okay.
I have a quick question, if I may.
Yes. Who's that? If you could just identify yourself.
Kamal.
Kamal.
Hi. I'm a student at King's.
Hello.
Could you elaborate on, are there like carbon brokerage firms that are like selling these offsets?
Okay, so who wants to quickly describe the way the voluntary carbon market works at the moment? Who feels expert in doing that? Stephen, I think I might turn to you because this is something you're very familiar with and you deal with these firms all the time.
Kamal, the voluntary carbon market is made up of thousands of little different organizations. In terms of the component between the buyer and the seller, it typically is a broker. So there are a number of different brokerages services that are available. So you pay your money to a broker, they will then scour the market. This is a very simple, oversimplified example, but they'll go scour the market for the right types of credits that meet your performance, and they will then return that back to you, give you a price, you pay the money to the broker, they pass the money on to the supplier. There are lots of other kind of new financial mechanisms for to drive long-term purchase agreements called offtakes, where you could, for example, commit to buying a credit that might not necessarily have happened yet. So it might be happening in 2030 or into the future, but it's allowing you to secure your supply of credits for the future when you need them.
So is there a global carbon stock, sort of carbon storage stock?
So the individual projects sit within essentially a registries. The big ones are Vera, Gold Standard, and they have a certified that 1 ton of CO2 has either been avoided or reduced, and they give that individual credit a unique ID. And so then that allows you, for example, Kamal, if you wanted to purchase the credit yourselves, you would then buy that from the broker, and then that credit would then get retired, so it cannot be sold on again.
Right. Thank you.
Good. So let's just get to the, I mean, I think the nitty gritty often is, so what is it going to cost us? And we've had some discussion about prices. It's possible when you book a flight often to offset for a few dollars a flight, quite a long flight. So there are lots of very cheap carbon credits in the market. You know, these are the ones I think that have become very controversial, but they are widely traded and widely available. How should we judge those? In general, at King's, what we say, our policy is that unless you're mandated to do so, so unless you're funded by the Wellcome Trust, we recommend that you don't buy those offsets, so you don't offset your own flights, for instance. How does, you know, an ordinary consumer or a university make sense of you know, what is a responsible carbon credit? And maybe I'll put this to Eleanor, actually, because this is something that goes a little bit to all the work that you've been doing on the quality of credits. I mean, presumably there are certain kinds of credits, these particularly these forestry conservation credits that you were talking about, that you believe are actually of high quality and justified. And what sort of price are we then thinking about when we're thinking about those kinds of credits?
Okay, I'm going to have to be a little bit careful what I say about this at the moment, because the university hasn't announced the details of this purchase yet, and some of these details are therefore confidential.
Okay.
But what I think I can say is that our research team has done assessments on a lot of different projects which have attempted to assess how much carbon we think they are storing. And typically we've found that the amount of carbon being stored is less than what is being advertised.
Yeah.
Okay, so the amount of so what Vera says represents, you know, a credit represents 1 carbon ton. We would probably usually find that there is some additionality, but that it's a fraction of what's being said based on our method of assessment. Now, Vera will dispute whether we're right or not. They'll say that we're being unnecessarily conservative and that their methods are good. And we will say, well, we think that you should be being more conservative for a variety of reasons. So our approach relies on a particular view of counterfactuals. So if you're going to assess additionality, if you're going to say, well, this extra carbon is now being stored, which wouldn't otherwise have been stored, then you have to have a model of what you think would have happened if you didn't do anything.
Yes.
And typically, many of those baselines have been established in the past on a kind of a narrative basis, where you know, the people representing the project say, well, if we didn't do this very important work that we're doing, then, you know, everything here would be demolished and knocked down and it would all be turned into a car park. And that may not be true. Or it may just be, you know, there's obviously conflicts of interest here. I mean, it's in the interest of the project to get the money to do what they want to do, which may well be very good, but they have to represent what would happen otherwise. If they don't have a clear method for doing that, then it's difficult to assess. So our method isn't the only method around. There are a number of different scientific approaches to doing this, but the one that we have tended to favour is one called pixel matching, where instead of matching the project area to another big area, you say, well, we're going to select lots of little land areas and match them on a range of relevant parameters about how the land is being used and how high above sea level it is and what kind of trees are growing there and all that kind of stuff. And then in relation to an average of the deforestation rates on all those different pixels, we then compare that to what's happening in the project area. And on that basis, we then make an estimate about how much additionality we think we can say is being provided by this project. And as I say, we usually conclude, oh, well, it's a bit less than what's been concluded by other methods. And so we also tend to think that carbon credits are a bit too cheap, certainly in terms of incentivizing behaviour change. I mean, if you don't have to spend very much money, it becomes a licensing thing, doesn't it? Oh, I feel better now about my flight because I've spent $5. So we feel that it's right that people have to make a significant sacrifice financially if they're going to take that flight. We also, therefore, you know, based on what we think those credits are storing, we therefore apply a multiplier and we say, all right, so in fact, to make a whole carbon ton, you're going to need quite a lot more of these things. So they may have been cheap to buy, but to make a whole carbon ton, you need to sandwich a bunch of them together, and that's going to give you a significantly higher price. And so that's the way that the university plans to charge people. And it will all be voluntary. So nobody's going to be forced to spend this money, and they may not be able to because it will depend on whether they can get the money back from their funding bodies or not, basically. But if they have some money that they're allowed to spend, but they can't offset the whole amount in terms of the price that the university is setting for a carbon ton, then we're going to let them offset a fraction of the amount, you know, depending on how much money they've got. Let's say, you know, we're saying they need to spend £100 and they've only got 50 from their budget that they can apply to this. We'll say, fine, you know, okay, spend £50, but you haven't actually offset the whole of your flight. So we won't count that as having offset the small units. We'll only count it as having offset the university's units of having kind of lumped everything together. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, no, really, really interesting. But it also demonstrates again how fiendishly complex this all is actually. And really, really interesting. The second, if no one else has a question, the second question I had is what, you know, so say we're going to offset, so what should we be offsetting? And business related, so university business related aviation has come up a couple of times. And that's certainly the way we came into this, because we were developing a new sustainable travel policy, and then the question of offsetting cropped up. And then we thought, well, actually, we need a whole of organization policy, not just related to this little slug of things, to have a rationale for it. I wonder whether the panel could just respond to that question. Are there always going to be strong reasons for seeking to offset? The trust requires you to do it. Aviation-related emissions. Are there other kinds of emissions that we should be thinking about now, or actually are aviation emissions the wrong set of, as it were, residual emissions to be thinking about? I don't know whether any of the panel want to respond to that. So what are the group of emissions we should be thinking about when we're thinking about offsetting? Anyone want to respond to that? Malcolm, you seem to have your...
Yeah, Franz, I think it was the scope of that, because is it our students travel to get to the UK, or is it academic travel? You know, and we're seeking in King's, and I think other universities are going along the same path, seeking to both highlight the impact of air travel and to give very, very strong advice and guidance that air travel should be restricted to both necessity and to geographies. But we are still seeking to import thousands of students every year into the UK, which is absolutely essential to our economy. So I think it would be a really interesting discussion about the scope of that residual carbon.
Franz,
Gulchin,
could I just...
how should we approach this question?
A related but somewhat different point. So coordination among universities is going to be key going forward. So when we talk about what kind of activities, what we need to have to offset, what kind of mechanisms we need to use, if we don't do this in a coordinated manner, there will always be issues where one institution taking a shortcut might benefit from doing that. So, for example, this kind of new metric about the students' flights and, you know, how we compensate that if we do. I think it's a relatively new concept as compared with a number of other activities. And if we don't report in a similar way, there are lots of big questions that, you know, that will make us find it very difficult to do the right thing. Let me put it that way, because we have obviously other priorities. Given the UK system, attracting students, overseas students, is key to our operations, and I think that's the same for all universities. So if we have key differences between how we report and how we are monitored in some way, we are going to find it really, really difficult to do the right thing going forward. So in that sense, I think standardization, both in terms of reporting and also how we respond, what kind of offsets we use, is really important. You gave the example of very inexpensive carbon credits. What stops us using those and arguing that we are being proactive properly?
Can I then turn to Fiona, maybe, because with the Climate Coalition, of course, you have established, as it were, a sort of common approach across the sector. What would your advice be on Gulchin's challenge about, you know, common approaches actually working across the board? We've seen actually universities doing rather different things. What are the commonalities? And just again on business-related aviation emissions, could you just elaborate a bit more on that? You said many universities were doing that, partly stimulated by Wellcome.
Absolutely, and just taking on Gulchin's first point is the reporting. It is crucial in terms of what you report. And the EAUC, on behalf of the sector, developed the standardised carbon emissions framework, which is for a framework for carbon reporting for universities and colleges. And that very much standardises where different areas. It's just the greenhouse gas protocol. We've not reinvented a whole new thing, but just interpreted that in terms of what does that actually look like for a university or a college. So, for example, where do international student flights sit under that? So do go and have a look at that, and I'll put a link in the chat afterwards about this. So I think that's the first bit, is really be transparent about your reporting. And I think you know, again, just having that transparency is crucial, and publicly reporting it, communicating it to your staff and your students, but also communicating what you are doing to reduce that. And I think the whole aviation question, it's very looked at in a very black and white way. It shouldn't be. It's a very grey area. Yes, there will still be internal flights. Yes, international students are crucial for higher education economies. So having a really aggressive international recruitment policy completely goes against your carbon reduction policy.
Yeah.
And that's something universities have got to grapple with. And basically, you need to be transparent about it. You have to include the flights of the students coming that you are bringing into the UK to come to your university. But then be transparent in terms of how you can reduce emissions in other areas. You can still reduce business travel. You can ban domestic flights, for example. You know, you can, and I think it's very harsh to paint a brush for research, for example. But again, taking Inju's point about the systemic change that needs to happen, you know, early career researchers, they say that it's crucial for them to go to all these international conferences. But why? What is the system? The system needs to change in order to enable that behaviour change, in order to have successful research careers without having all that international travel. And I think that's a really crucial part. And the environmental concordat that's come out in the past couple of weeks, is really trying to address that in the research and innovation sector in terms of really trying to change that system. So I think it's not black and white. You can't just go, well, we'll carry on flying, but we'll all offset. It's how do we reduce the impact of our flying, but also how can we fly better, travel better. So you're not just flying to one conference, go into that one conference, maybe go and visit some other universities while you're there, go and find out what they're doing about their sustainability, you know, combine it with other activities so it's more worthwhile travel rather than just isolated purpose travel.
Okay, very, very useful. Stephen, you had your hand up. You need to be unmuted.
Oh, sorry. I've got a question for you, Franz. And Malcolm, what is your, because we've heavily focused just then talking about aviation travel. What percentage of your scope 1, 2, and 3 is aviation travel?
So business-related aviation, I think this is right, and Yona will correct me if I'm wrong, is the 4th most important scope 3 emission category that we have as a university. So it's not the top emission, but it's and it is about, gosh, we have a number. It's about 5,000 tons or something like that a year. It was in 2019. Oddly enough, of course, it stopped broadly during COVID. We've had a very, very powerful rebound, and you know, the numbers show us that in 22-23. We spent almost twice as much on travel at King's as we had in 2018-2019. That's a COVID rebound, and we need to see whether they will stabilize at that level. So actually the level of business travel has exploded actually in the last couple of years, which is not what we expected at all, because we thought people would have got used to Teams and doing things online and so on, but actually people are traveling again. So yeah, that's one of the findings we've got.
And Franz, the reason why I asked that question, and possibly slightly deliberately, was just to understand the size of the scale of the challenge that you're tackling here. If there are, you know, you can focus on aviation and we can bash aviation quite rightly or wrongly as we so choose to, but there's other things within you which have got larger emissions, which if you're going to make a 10% saving there, you're going to make a much bigger difference. So I would also make sure that we're keeping that broad spectrum at looking across all of this rather than just going straight for aviation.
I think that's a really good point, Stephen, because you know the economics of higher education in the UK will not survive without international air travel, and I really feel that there is so much around our estates, the way in which we use the estate, the extent of the estate. We're just about to have our first major all-electric building when we refurbish Bush House Southwest Wing. There will be no gas boilers in there. It will be all electric. And hopefully it will all be decarbonised electric supply. We've looked at the cost of the environmental improvements that we need to make around in that building. There's a very easy payback. It's about a 12-year payback at current energy prices. You know, that is it's large amounts of money, but it's a very easy investment decision to make. And it's those sorts of big investment decisions that I think that we should be prioritizing in the next couple of years.
Absolutely, Malcolm. I couldn't agree. And if you're going to raise money from your levy, from your funds, go stick it into those activities to help decarbonise, because that's really going to make the big difference here.
Yeah, great, good. I think we're coming to the end of the time we have. I might go round the panel one more time. Any final words of wisdom, pearls of wisdom you have to give to us? I'll start with Inji. Any sort of final thoughts you have, or things that you've been triggered by hearing today?
Yeah, I think I'd just like to end on that point about the offsetting strategy being holistic and including both those elements of compensation and contribution. So the compensation element is addressing your in-house emissions and isolating only the residual ones to use offsetting, and again using those high quality offsets and all the rest of it. But this contribution angle that has been, or is much wider than often people first think of, and really encouraging others to get creative in that capacity, and kind of identifying that framework as compensation, you're just kind of paying your climate bill, and contribution, it's the tip on top. It's where you can, where universities can make that difference. Yeah,
and so that has to be part of the way we tell the story and take action. Yeah, very good. Gulchin, any final thoughts?
Thanks, Franz. I think my final thought is, given the improvement in technology and our understanding of what is available, clearly I learned a lot within the last hour and a half. There are loads of things being available all the time, coming into market as measures of, or kind of tools of offsetting. We should do our best to choose this very, very carefully to make sure it does not replace what should happen. But I am more convinced than an hour and a half ago that we absolutely should be very proactive in going down this route, however, choosing extremely carefully what we offset and how we offset it.
Okay, I'm just being made aware again that actually we promised to do a poll at the end, and these polls are usually very good fun, so and very useful to us. Iona, are you ready to launch the poll? Would that be possible? So perhaps what we are going to do is invite you quickly to do the poll. So there are a number of questions here, which I hope are related to the topics we've debated today. And I think that'll be the final act of today, because we've run out of time. I just want to thank the panel for a really fantastic discussion, so interesting, and the contributions and the very, the range of opinions and actually the expertise we've heard has been so useful, I think, today. So thank you so much, and also for the range of views actually that we need to consider. So I think with that we'll close the discussion, but please could you now address the poll, which I hope is in the middle of your screen. There are 3 questions, and you just you fill them in and move to the next page and then fill them in, and as you do that, Iona will be able to post the range of responses that we're getting. Great. Iona, how are the responses going?
So we've got 22 responses in at the moment, so still a few people left. So if you could still complete that, would be great. But happy to summarize in the meantime, as I'm aware we're running over time. So hopefully you can see the aggregated responses yourselves as well. But it's very interesting on this first question about residual emissions. The majority, so about 48%, have voted for the option that emissions that are difficult to avoid and may be considered critical to the university's missions, such as aviation. On the second question, so about how we should address residual emissions, the majority have voted for investing equivalent funds in the university's decarbonisation efforts, but also quite close after that, investing equivalent funds in research and education to develop new technologies for offsetting, including carbon capture and storage. So I think that's something that was highlighted a lot throughout the session today. And then the third question around, is offsetting the right approach to handle residual emissions? There's quite strong agreement that it is partially, but should not be the primary strategy, which I think was also a very key takeaway from the discussion today.
Fantastic. So once again, thank you so much. I hope everyone found this useful and interesting. It was a very, very helpful part of our process as we move towards trying to understand what we ourselves need to do at King's. So thank you very much indeed for participating. And I'm just trying to think. We haven't planned another. This is the last of the debates we're planning, isn't that right, Yona?
Yeah, for now, but I think there's a lot of discussions still to be had. So I'm sure there will be more opportunities in future.
I suspect we might have one more debate, which is really trying to debate the draft policy that we're currently developing, probably in the autumn, early in the autumn, as part of the engagement we need to do around that. Thank you all very much indeed. Bye bye.